You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Michael E. Smith, professor of anthropology and archaeologist at Arizona State's School of Human Evolution and Social Change. We talk with Michael about his article in Aeon Magazine entitled Energized Crowding about life in early cities and neighborhoods. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks for supporting each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of zoning nerds and infrastructure wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Heavy knit bus or bike only, or lightweight bike only with fading checkerboard design. Sign up at patreon.com/theoverheadwire and I'll send one right along. You can also purchase the scarves at theoverheadwire.com. Get your fresh Elmo or fresh Kermit before winter arrives. Order now at theoverheadwire.com. Also, because we do a lot of episodes covering a lot of books, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire shop on Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on the show and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've ever discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And finally, check out the Overhead Wire Daily Newsletter, established in 2006. We were doing it way before anyone else thought it was cool. Join thousands of readers and sign up for a 2-week trial at theoverheadwire.com to check it out. That's a 2-week free trial at theoverheadwire.com. Michael Smith, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Oh, it's good to be here.
Well, thanks for being on the show. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am an archaeologist. I teach at Arizona State, and I have many years of experience directing excavations in Mexico at Aztec sites. And for a long time, I've been interested in comparative urbanism, starting out with early cities, and then more recently getting into urbanism in general and how early cities compare to contemporary cities. And that's what I'm working on right now.
How did you get into archaeology? What was the first introduction to it for you? Was it when you were a kid, or was it when you got a little bit older?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, I didn't know what I wanted to major in. I was a math major, a music major, and a biology major. But then I read a book about archaeology, and it was sort of a screwy book, and I was embarrassed to admit this for many years, that this got me interested. It was about the lost civilization of Atlantis. It was supposedly an advanced civilization that sank into the sea, and the people set out in boats, and they came over to Mexico, and they became the Olmecs and the Mayas and the Aztecs. And I thought that was the coolest thing I'd ever heard. So I started reading up on the Olmecs and the Mayas and the Aztecs, and I soon found that they were fascinating cultures. And there was a professor, I was at Brandeis, he was a professor there, George Cogill, who worked on the Mexican city of Tehuacan. So I started working for him as an undergraduate research assistant and went on to graduate study, and I've been working in the Mexican archaeology ever since.
That's awesome. It's interesting. Archaeology and pop culture is a really interesting kind of connection, especially when you're thinking about, some things that are somewhat fairy tales, but also Indiana Jones and all that other stuff as well. Are there any connections for you between archaeology and pop culture that kind of stand out in positive ways or maybe even negative ways? You mentioned, you're thinking about Atlantis, and that's an interesting connection as well for, I guess, a historic pop culture for that matter.
Well, a feature like Indiana Jones is sort of controversial in archaeology. Some archaeologists say, well, it's ridiculous. He loots sites. He's doing unethical things. It's not archaeology at all. And other people say, well, he gets people interested in archaeology, so that's a good thing. And then we can teach in our classes what he does wrong and what he does right and use that.
So you're interested in comparative urbanism. Maybe give us a little bit of a definition of what that means and how it impacts your work.
Well, when I first got going on this, I was involved in excavating Aztec cities in Mexico, and it was to compare Aztec cities or other ancient Mesoamerican cities with cities in Egypt or Mesopotamia or Greece and Rome, and sort of early cities around the world, making comparisons to learn something about urbanism in general. I got started, a while ago, thinking about, well, how do ancient cities relate to contemporary cities? And can they be compared? In some ways, they're radically different. In some ways, they're quite similar. And so that's sort of a more complicated kind of comparison to make.
It's really interesting. I mean, this is kind of the crux of your article, which discusses energized crowding as kind of an idea that I find really fascinating. I'm curious where you came up with the general term or the idea of energized crowding, and how does that fit into the comparative urbanism discussion overall?
Well, the term originated with Spyro Kostov, who was a architectural historian at Berkeley. I wrote a number of books on early cities and architecture, and he used energized crowding just for the situation that cities have lots of people, dense populations, people interact, and that process of social interact, has effects and creates a lot of what's distinctive about cities. I got involved in some of the work on urban scaling that I talk about in that article. It was based at the Santa Fe Institute, and that work is sort of based on the similar idea that the size and density of population influences the social interactions, and social interactions then generate outcomes. So energized crowding is just a way of talking about, the social situation in cities and why it's important.
It sounds a lot like what economists call the agglomeration effect or agglomeration economies. I'm curious what the connections are between the two.
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar kind of thing. Agglomeration economies is usually, where do firms locate and where do people locate? But the basic idea that the concentration of people and firms and activities has effects that go beyond the immediate interaction. Yeah, it's basically the same idea.
It's really interesting too, like how you can extrapolate that to ancient cities versus contemporary ones. And it seems like a similar metric, and you have a similar ability to look back and see that things that we might see as different are actually very similar today. And you can actually, based on the research that the Santa Fe Institute has done, you can look at that kind of mathematically and see how cities grew and how they interacted with each other. And then you take that back in time and it's kind of a similar way. And I mean, that was the most fascinating thing to me, was that you can connect the two, which, like you said, it was not something people thought that could be connected ultimately.
Well, yeah. And, if you sort of look at how do cities today differ from those in the ancient world and how are they similar, they're similar in this area of it's where people live, it's where people interact, social interactions have effects, and that's, sort of the basic facts of urban life. They're very different in terms of communication, technology, and things like that.
So, what do you get from looking at these ancient neighborhoods? Looking at neighborhoods instead of maybe ziggurats or pyramids or the kind of more famous archaeological icons of historic development?
Well, there's different kinds of archaeology, and I sometimes talk about monumental archaeology versus social archaeology. And the monumental archaeology is, yeah, digging the pyramids and looking for the royal tombs and the big buildings, and that gives us information. That's important work. But social archaeology is about figuring out the nature of life in the past and how was society organized. So in that sense, I'd rather, excavate a neighborhood than a pyramid.
And what do you find when you excavate neighborhoods?
Well, it turns out neighborhoods are hard to excavate just because it's fairly resource intensive to excavate a house, right? Just excavate one house, the size, how deep it is, and so on. That can be a big operation. And a neighborhood is many houses, and issues of sampling come in. You can't excavate all the houses in a neighborhood, so you can only excavate some of them. Can you sample them adequately? Well, maybe there's a modern city on top. Like the Aztec cities I've worked on are basically underneath modern cities. So sampling is a big problem. So it's hard to, get a handle on a whole neighborhood.
And how does that work out? I mean, like when you do figure out a whole neighborhood, like what does that tell you specifically about the culture that lived there? What was the normal way that people lived life?
Well, one of the things that archaeologists have found is that there's a lot of variation. I think, I don't know, there was a general assumption for a while that, oh, we're going to find, the wealthy neighborhood or the poor neighborhood. But it turns out that most cases where we have that kind of information, you had a variety of levels of wealth or status. And so there's a lot of variation. There's also variation in the extent to which, sometimes neighborhoods were specialized in terms of craft production activities or trade or something. And in other cases, they seem to be more generalized. So there aren't sort of easy patterns from this.
Another thing you discussed in the article is kind of like governance structures, which I found interesting. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about those and maybe what people felt like most government structures were like and what you actually believe they were like.
Well, there was a story for a long time that all ancient societies had despotic rulers, autocratic regimes. People were enslaved. Slaves built the pyramids. And then the Greeks invented democracy. Oh, yeah, great. But Several lines of research in the last 10, 15 years have shown that that's really not the case. There were democratic, some people say we shouldn't use that term, well, more collectively organized in the past before the Greeks. And it's not a simple matter of all ancient states were autocratic and then they became democratic. There was a lot of variation. The difficulty for archaeologists is how do you tell this archaeologically? And we're developing methods and some measures. So just if you look at, say, Mesoamerica, Mexico, and Guatemala, and so on, where I work, some early states seem to have been quite collective in their organization, and others seem more autocratic. So there's research to try to document those and analyze that.
What are some of the signs that you can tell about whether a place is more social or more autocratic, the different types of governance structures?
Yeah.
How do you kind of tell?
Well, a nice contrast is Teotihuacan in central Mexico and the classic Maya cities in southern Mesoamerica. And the classic Maya cities, the first thing you saw walking into the main plaza was a bunch of sculptures showing the king in all his regalia, being powerful, and a hieroglyphic text saying how great and powerful he was. And we know the names of those kings. We've reconstructed dynasties. At Teotihuacan, we don't know who the kings were. There's no obvious depiction of a king on sculpture or painting. At the Maya sites, the kings had big, fancy royal palaces. At Teotihuacan, well, we're not even positive what the royal palace was. And that's sort of unusual for an ancient site. I mean, I worked on Aztec sites, and, we know what the palace was. We don't go scratch our heads, go, was there a royal palace here? If there's a palace that was preserved, we know it. It's obvious. At Teotihuacan, there's one structure that we think, well, maybe it was, but it's not quite so different from all the others. So there's definitely, comparing Teotihuacan and the Maya had more emphasis on individual rulers, the size of their palaces compared to Teotihuacan.
It's interesting because if you read back on some of, the historic literature on cities, or at least, up until the 60s and 70s with people like Lewis Mumford, or he talks about the kind of evolution from going from tribes to the elder governance structures where you have a circle of people who decide things, and then you go into the strongman and the hoarders. So there's like kind of a linear discussion about that governance structure. And I find that really fascinating, especially what you were talking about related to the differences. And I'm wondering how you've seen that maybe they evolved into those structures. Like, did you see that at Teotihuacan something different happened than, say, in the Mayan structures that actually led to this? Or is it something that's hard to kind of decipher?
I'll just say it's hard to decipher how. That's an excellent question, and we just don't know.
What's your favorite part about the structures down there in Mexico, like in terms of the city structure, the differences between the Mayan and maybe the Aztec cultures?
Well, one thing that I've mentioned is the nature of urban planning. To what extent were the downtown areas planned out? Were the residences planned out? How strong was sort of central planning of cities? And Teotihuacan was very centrally planned. There's a single orthogonal grid covering the whole city with thousands of buildings. At the Maya sites, Aztec sites too, the residences were not lined up. They're not orthogonal, all over the place. Obviously, no one was how residential areas should be laid out. Neighborhoods, had their own dynamic that was separate from the political power. And so I find it interesting, the sort of differences in the sort of top-down versus bottom-up forces that shape cities. I have a paper about Teotihuacan. I call it the Teotihuacan Anomaly, because it was so bizarre, the fact that it was all planned. And after Teotihuacan fell, the cities that came immediately went back to the older plan. Have pyramids around plazas as opposed to a central avenue and orthogonal planning. And it's like they were saying, we don't want any more of this Teotihuacan stuff. We're going to go back to the ancient thing. So something at Teotihuacan was very different, and then it was rejected by later cities.
How long did that last, Teotihuacan?
We'll say 500 years or so.
That's interesting. It also gets into the kind of your discussion about the size of settlements and neighborhoods and what that means for when people start to kind of get restless. That was another interesting part as well. In the story, you're talking about how, like, when you get past, I guess, 10,000 people, or if there's like a limit to civilization where, if you don't have structures in place, then, things start to fall apart maybe if you get past a certain, like, population.
Oh, well, there's the Burning Man data, which I don't know if is that in the article? Maybe.
No, I don't think the Burning Man did, but I'd love to hear about it.
It's in a paper I wrote critical of the book The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow. And the thing that happened with Burning Man is it started off as a bunch of people on a beach with a big fire, and then it developed into this major gathering, thousands of people. It's very anarchic principles, right? I'm sure you know about Burning Man, and very explicitly, self-consciously sort of anarchic, anti-hierarchical, and so on. And it was sort of anything goes, but they were on federal land. And in 1996, the population reached, I think it was 8,600 or so. And people were shooting off guns and getting drunk and driving cars into campsites. And it was really sort of chaotic. And the government said, we're not going to let you do this if you don't put get some order here. And overnight, they had planning. The whole circular thing you see from Burning Man, that started in 1 year. It's like, all right, we're doing this now. It's all going to be completely planned. And there's, the Burning Man Department of Planning, and there's regulations, and they have neighborhoods. If you want to party all night, you go over to this area. If you have kids, they want them to sleep, you go to that area. But it shows that, did fine with without central planning, with anarchic kinds of principles. But when they reached a certain point, they needed to institute planning and organization.
Yeah, and the idea that you have neighborhoods to kind of compartmentalize the largeness of a place or create order is really fascinating to me too.
Well, people don't want to live their lives on the scale of thousands and thousands of people. And also, a lot of things in the economy and society work better on a smaller scale. And so one of the interesting things about neighborhoods, looking across culturally, is that sometimes they're imposed, they're built from the start. Today, the whole planned development is a neighborhood. It's how sitting in Phoenix here, as Phoenix expands, it doesn't expand, street by street. It expands neighborhood by neighborhood. They construct the whole thing. And in the ancient past, the same kind of thing. A lot of, Roman sites at Teotihuacan, neighborhoods were built in from the start. In other cases, they weren't built in. And, people were allowed to build their houses, do what they wanted. Well, neighborhoods developed generatively. They developed, on their own from the way people lived their lives and did their basic activities. So neighborhoods can either be top down from the start, or they can be developed, by people themselves.
I think that's part of your theory as well in terms of the discussion about energized crowding overall, is that kind of top down versus bottom up theory. I'm curious which one creates, in your mind, what kind of outcomes do each one kind of create? Are they different, or are they similar in the end? Do they come to the same space, after two different ways of getting there?
They often end up looking very different. So for an archaeologist, we're dealing with the actual, the layout, the physical plan that we can see, and they look very different. A lot of people in planning think that generative neighborhoods are more livable and a more satisfactory form of life. Now, I don't know whether that's the case. That's sort of what the new urbanists think, and going back to Christopher Alexander, people like that, drawing on vernacular architecture, will produce a better way of life through traditional methods that are not involve central planning. Is that really the case? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't, I don't have data to say that's not the case.
Yeah.
It certainly makes sense. Oh, that's a nice story. And, maybe there's research on it. I just don't know.
Well, we just had Nolan Gray on to talk about his book, Arbitrary Lines, which talks about zoning, and his kind of stance is that, we should abolish zoning and have some other sort of like nuisance organization that makes a better case for how we allow cities to be more organic rather than top down. And it's kind of an interesting look if you think about that from history. Another book that I mentioned to him last week was this book called Zoned Out by Professor Jonathan Levine at the University of Michigan. And his kind of theory is that, there's a lot of places around the world that have this generative property, places like Greece, that actually, when somebody builds a house and then they have kids and they need a place for the kids to be, so they build a second story, and that's okay. Maybe they go through and build a third story and a fourth, and then this whole complex develops, versus Silicon Valley, for example, where they just, cut down the fruit trees and single family homes forever, and that's it. And so you don't have any really chance to be organic. And so I find that fascinating as well, and thinking about those two properties, the top down and the bottom up of planning, and what that means for societies in general, and whether that means more agglomeration effects, more energized crowding, or we're actually physically spacing people apart from each other. That's kind of, depressing that energy that actually is trying to bubble up from the bottom.
Well, I think that's what the new urbanists would say. And, the sterility of suburbia and the nature of lifestyles and all. In many places in the ancient world and around the world today and in developing countries, you don't have that level of zoning. And so if you want to open a little shop in your house, you can do that. I can't do that. If I opened up a store in my house, I'll sit down and get me for it.
Exactly.
But it's sort of, that allows work and residents to be, in the same place. And that's pretty common, I think, in the ancient world.
What about transportation? You mentioned kind of the grid network and how things were laid out, but I'm curious in transportation networks in the ancient world and what they look like. There was a discussion in the article about how there were some places that were very, central and more dense, and then others that had kind of satellite neighborhoods to a certain extent. I'm curious, like how the transportation, fit into that, urbanization trend.
Well, I mean, I work in Mesoamerica, and so the only transportation was people walking and carrying
Right.
things on their back. And that obviously sets limits on the size of cities because how far you can bring food and, has all kinds of constraints on urbanism. In the old world, where you have wheeled transport, carts, and so on, Rome had 1 million people. Why? Because they shipped grain across the Mediterranean. But yeah, transport costs really, limit the size and nature of cities in many areas.
How has the discussion changed over the last, you mentioned the last 10, 15 years for certain topics, but like the last 15, 20, even 30 years in terms of thinking about ancient cities?
I think there's a lot more appreciation of variability. There's just not a single form of city. I mean, one of the standard books was Sjoberg's The Pre-Industrial City, which is basically there is one form of pre-industrial city, and it's different from industrial cities. I read it as an undergrad. I thought, wow, this is great. I want to work on this. But I realized, well, the pre-industrial cities I was studying archaeologically were quite different from what he described. So we now recognize, I mean, low density urbanism, that's a sort of a hot topic in archaeology, the Maya and other places where people are really spread out. Yet, cities had political and religious functions, even if their population densities were lower than, most sort of, say, old world cities. So that variation is one of the main differences. Also, people are starting to appreciate the nature of generative and bottom up forces. I mean, this old view that, all ancient states were despotic. That's the way we thought about things when I got into archaeology. It was all of these rulers exploiting people and promoting their own power, and the notion that people acting independently could account for anything. We just didn't talk about that. That didn't seem to be anything that happened. And from my point of view, that has sort of come into archaeology from other branches of urban studies, from planning and sociology and economics.
It's really interesting, especially in light of, like you mentioned previously, people who are, kind of despotic or kings or whatever, they leave marks for themselves. But otherwise, you wouldn't know unless there was some sort of something that told the story of a place that was more small d democratic or, social, collective in their governance structure, which is, I think, is really interesting to me. It's like history is written by the victors.
Well, yeah.
Unfortunately. Yeah. Another thing that was interesting to me was I always like to think about Lewis Worth and his 1938 piece, Urbanism as a Way of Life. We read it out in full. The University of Chicago was kind enough to allow us to do that for our 200th episode.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so I'm kind of interested in how that influences you as well, that his discussion of cities and the way he thinks about, as you get larger, the heterogeneity of everything, the diversity of cities allows people to specialize, allows people to be organized in groups, but they don't really have to be, connected to the group. They can kind of be loosely affiliated. It's interesting how that actually impacts cities and neighborhoods. And I'm wondering if that kind of holds true for the ancient world as well as, today.
Well, Worth's definition of urbanism has been very influential in archaeology. And one of my first publications, I argue strongly for his definition. And later papers of mine, I've argued against it. and because, it's a permanent settlement with large population, high population density, and social heterogeneity. That's what a city is. And that works for cities today. That would apply to Teotihuacan and some of the Aztec cities I've worked on, but it would not apply to the ancient Maya. Those weren't cities just because they don't fit Worth's definition. They weren't big enough. They weren't dense enough. And so sort of an alternate functional definition came in based on economic geography and central place theory, that if a place fulfills regional functions, political, economic, religious, you can call it a city. Doesn't matter how many people live there. And so, there's been an argument, well, the Maya fit the functional definition of cities, but they don't fit Worth's definition. So we argue about these things.
Sounds like fun, actually. to have these arguments about history. So you're writing a book about the topic that we're discussing, energized crowding. I'm curious what the idea is behind it and, when it's coming out. I'm actually really looking forward to reading it.
Well, I've done I've checked copy editing, and then the proofs are supposed to be here in 2 weeks. So 2023, Cambridge Press. It's called Urban Life in the Distant Past, the Prehistory of Energized Crowding. And it synthesizes a lot of what I've done on urbanism and comparative urbanism over the last 15 years. There's a chapter on the size of cities and why that's important and what variation is. There's chapters on cities and political organization in the past, this whole business of autocratic collective states and so on. There's a chapter on economic organization, kinds of economies and economic growth. And there's chapters on sort of top down and bottom up forces on urban life. It sort of synthesizes. This article from Aeon is sort of a rough summary of a lot of the book. It's a teaser. Get people.
Yeah, well, it got me.
All right, well, good.
It got me. I'm also fascinated, how you measure economics in the ancient world. You measure them by the size of houses. How does that actually tell you anything about what the wealth of a society is?
There's actually quite a bit of comparative evidence from history and ethnography that shows not necessarily in modern industrialized nations, it's more complicated, but in pre-industrial settings, historical settings, the size of a house is often a very good measure of wealth. It's not absolute, it's not a determinate relationship, but it's a very strong statistical relationship. The size of a house comparatively is a good measure of the level of wealth within a given context, of course.
It's also interesting what you find in some of these ancient societies, and I think you mentioned it before, but you find that they're actually wealthier than people maybe have thought before, and they have more goods and other things that you find, which is another fascinating kind of change in, I think, what most people think about historic societies.
Well, I don't want to say everything was rosy in the past and wonderful. There were problems, there was poverty, there was not the level of medicine and science, and health was not so great. But on the other hand, this old view that all ancient rulers were autocratic goes along with the idea that people were downtrodden and had no freedoms and had no wealth and basically were not much better than slaves. When in a lot of cases, people were doing fairly well economically. And that's the kind of thing that we're starting to be able to monitor archaeologically.
What's your next project? Besides the book, what's the next big thing that you're working on?
Well, just submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation for a comparative urban project, which looks at urban persistence, settlement persistence. How long did cities last in the ancient world? We don't know how long cities are going to last today. Up until 20 years ago, cities will last forever. But now with rising sea levels and shrink cities, land areas, maybe cities won't last forever. Well, the archaeological record is full of thousands of ancient cities and settlements, some of which lasted for 3 years, some of which lasted for 3,000 years. So the basic idea is to take some of this evidence from archaeology and history and see what we can learn about it. Why did some settlements last longer than others? Why did cities in one region last longer than cities in another region? And sort of to use spatial methods to these analyses and try to do time series analyses. And the thought behind it is that if we could figure out for the ancient world what factors contribute to longer lasting cities, maybe that applies today. Now, maybe it doesn't. I mean, this remains to be seen. It depends on the kinds of variables we were able to identify and whether they're comparable or not. It also depends on people who pay attention to modern cities think that at all, which a lot of people work on saying, well, ancient cities are interesting, but they're completely irrelevant. Technology is so different, and communication and transport and all that what you do in the past has no relevance at all. So, all right, well then, how are you going to figure out how cities are going to last into the future? What's your empirical basis for that? Well, it's things we think might help. Well, we have some empirical data on one set of cities. Let's see if they can be applicable or not.
I mean, I always think that people that say that what happened in the past doesn't matter is really a frustrating statement, always to me. I imagine that the folks that do research and scientists and things like that don't necessarily say that, but I've seen people say that actually out in the world, and it's frustrating.
Well, I'm saying that a lot of these scientists, they won't actually say it, but on the other hand, well, okay, are you looking at some of these Do you want to, are you interested in actually using some of these data? And so, well, we don't use those data. Why not? Well, maybe because they're not in a form they can use, or maybe because they don't want to. I don't know. This is something we're sort of trying to make some headway on.
Yeah, well, you and the Santa Fe Institute have started thinking about data, collection, at least putting together some data for, ancient cities that kind of correlates to the modern city. So I think that is really good format for kind of connecting the two.
That's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Where can folks find you if they want to find your work and your research?
Well, Arizona State University, and I'm on Twitter at Michael E. Smith, and put out most of my things on, through Twitter. Academia.edu has most of my publications. Well, they can find me at Arizona State University, and there's links to other things there.
Awesome. And then your book comes out in 2023. Is that correct?
Early 2023. Yeah.
We'll be watching for that. Well, Michael, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's been an interesting conversation.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.